I've got a question. Actually, I've got a couple requests here. People wanting to hear more about my atelier, saying there's not much information online. Tell me about how Paul's atelier works in the next video. All right, so I guess I better cover that. As much as this is what I'm doing is actually on the order of marketing. You're trying to get your ideas out there to differentiate yourself, as it were, from other people doing the same thing. I still am somewhat reticent to promote myself in an overt way, and I don't know why. It's really a mistake. I mean, people need to know that you exist. I had this enormous struggle trying to find any place to study at all, and finding Gammell was a sheer miracle. He'd written a book back in the 40s, The Twilight of Painting, which I saw in, 1975 maybe? So whatever that minor marketing that was, which probably was fairly good marketing for those days, the writing a book. Of course, the world was against him at the time, the media. It was an interesting thing about Gammell's book. I'm diverging now. But he wrote The Twilight of Painting and kept the clippings from newspapers that were sent to him from around the country. And it was like routinely, all the major newspapers, the New York Times, all the rest, just completely dissed what he was saying. And yet, all the little town newspapers loved what he was saying, positively loved what he was saying. And that in itself sort of triggers all sorts of interesting thoughts. But as some people say, that there's no such thing as bad marketing. You just, as long as they spell your name right, I think is what one politician said. So, nevertheless, I admit to being, everything I've done up till this point has been word of mouth, and my studio has stayed full. I have the capacity in my studio to have a dozen to 18 people studying at the same time, and I find that when I get to 18 and more, it's just too much for a single person. One of the things I'm trying to do is actually develop the Boston School Atelier system. I'm sorry, I take that back. The New England ateliers of drawing and painting to replace the Ingbretson studios of drawing and painting, because I want to help students coming up behind me to actually establish their own ateliers. And if you take an atelier the way I take it, and the way I believe you'll find Gammell thought of it, it's the opposite of a school. It's where a single painter takes a person and gives him everything he knows, really brings him along, like an apprentice, like a mentor in, say, an old-style university system. And your job is to really imbue the next generation with your knowledge and let them stand, as it were, on the shoulders of giants, or such as you are. So you find the Peruginos, yes, they were using the Raphaels, the Verrocchios, yes, they were using the Da Vincis to work in their studios, to work on their paintings, so they could make money and that sort of thing. This is not that. It's not a bodega or a workshop or whatever in that way. But the atelier system is definitely along those same lines, where you take people personally, take them seriously. So and bring them as far along as you can, as long as they remain interested and convinced that what you're doing is proximal enough to what their dreams are and what their hopes are and what will empower them to do those things. So so it's a system. In Gammell's discussion, he thought 5 or 6, maybe even said 4 or 5 people would be a maximum number you'd want to have. One of the things I'm seeing around the country now is this. They call them ateliers, but they actually are, the model really is a school model, and you wind up with several teachers and that sort of thing. It's just, the mind of a given painter is what you need. You need to get sort of deeply into somebody's head. We've tried to reduce it all to a set of little facts here, and if you just learn these facts, life will be good. But there's something more to it than that. I don't know what the word for it might be. That is what that thing is that winds up being passed on, through direct contact on a regular basis. So that being said, I don't have a school. I don't run a school. I teach people. I take people along privately at their own pace. I expect that they will work somewhere close to 20 hours a week, a minimum of that number, because they won't make progress. They'll be then blaming their teacher if they don't make progress. But if you have somebody working even as much as 15 to 20 hours, I had a student who really moved nicely working just weekends with me, and became a very strong, really went through everything, became a really strong in the things that I'm trying to achieve. And she did it working a full-time job astoundingly. But that crucial thing, getting in that 15 to 20 hours, I've never, at this point, I don't recall which of those it was, but that some of that comes from this whole discussion of the mastery, getting the mastery, how many hours it takes for you to actually begin to achieve your goals. And there was an old article I think I based this on back in 85 or so, not much long after I started, and it was from an article in, I think it was Esquire, maybe, magazine. Similar things have borne out. Most people are looking for more hours, and everybody nowadays, instead of talking about talent, is talking about 10,000 hours of well-directed practice. That's my model. I'm trying to be there, to be on your shoulder constantly, consistently throughout this entire process. But you're not just simply undirected. From the beginning, you're given the same assignments as we received in the Gammell studio, which I probably should describe to you first. The Gammell studio was truly an attempt of Gammell to bring back the best education as it was understood, that would give, that is to say, the best education that would make you into an academic painter. And obviously what I do is Boston school painting. That is to say, my proximity to Boston school painting is far closer, and therefore my ways of teaching are significantly different from my proximity to academic painting, even though I studied with Gammell. And in fact, the question that was up last week, I should have brought this up, but it was about whether or not these two different ways of working can be used in the same picture and that sort of thing. And I do remember making a number of attempts in that direction and finding that the Gammell teaching was confusing, because so many of the aphorisms were Boston school aphorisms. Paint as if you're coming out of a fog. We never did that. We had no idea what that would have meant. It wasn't something that Gammell laid on you. No, you're not painting as if you're coming out of a fog. And yet, in the Boston School way of working, which is what I teach, I bring that across to people early and often. The idea of arabesque takes on a different meaning when you use it as part of the methodology. As part of the process of setting up the basics of the ensemble of visual stuff that you're painting from. So many of those things. Anyway, I'm not telling you exactly what I'm doing in the studio, but. So Gammell would have you drawing casts. He would have you doing memory work from photographs of figures. He had a reading list. He told me I was the first person that ever asked him for a reading list, which I thought was pretty astounding, given how long ago he had written it up. But he had a nice reading list, including reviews of the books that he recommended. I don't know if it was maybe as many as 20 books at the time. And somewhere or other, somebody out there has got to tell me if they have that. It's one of the few things I don't have in terms of Gammell's writing. I've lost my copy of that, which is a bit of a tragedy to me at least. But I've got all those on a list. I just don't have Gammell's review of them. So you'd be reading, and he would have you reading other things. Gammell would be trying to educate you because he wanted to make you a good academic painter. So he'd be educating you in the classics. Dante. You'd be reading Dante's Inferno, Paradiso, and things like that, to get you really up to speed. He knew his guys were coming out of public school backgrounds mostly, and where he came from a Groton school background, which was really about as elite as a high school education as anybody can get in this country. Or at least it was at that time. So, and then from there, we would be working still life. Now, he brought to our attention what Reynolds said, and that is that anyone who can paint a still life can paint anything. When I was at the Art Students League, what we had done was worked from the figure day and night, and there was no instruction about composition that I saw from any of 6 different people I worked with. Nothing you would call systematic, for sure. There are a few, comments here and there. it wasn't a studio of picture making. The studio's down there. You maybe, but nobody. There's again no conversation. Gammell said his studio, and this is mine as well. He says my studio is designed around picture making. We make pictures. And of course his structure was such, and mine's the same, where he said that he quoted Paxton. He said, "This is what we're trying to do is get you so well educated as a painter, so skilled as a painter in the craft of painting that you could do whatever's called for." And so that has everything to do with the craft of paint handling. Stretching canvas is a good, keeping a quality surface that you can paint on more and over and over again. And those sorts of things. So the craft conversation was coming up all the time. It wasn't set apart like in a classroom somewhere where you sat there and talked about those things in isolation. It always came up as part of the making of this particular picture. And then we were doing figure drawing and we were doing portrait painting, and they were intermittent and simultaneously. There's no question that while you did your cast drawing for that year or more. And one of the things that's different about a lot of what's happening out there now is that Gammell and us, in my relationship with Gammell, we worked on a cast maybe 2 weeks straight, very rarely more than 2 weeks. I don't think I ever got to 3 weeks. And the discussion went on between myself and Mr. Gammell about pushing these things. And he said, you don't need to. What you need to accomplish is, if you can't accomplish the important things in 2 weeks, there's no point in keeping on. That's a very Boston School way of thinking. But we do the same thing. We don't sit there and noodle for 6 months on a single picture, and we especially aren't doing it making copies of bargs and things like that. So I'm saying these things not to pick on anybody. I'm just trying to differentiate myself in what we do and don't do. While I was with Gammell, and I do recommend that for students, I had people, we went and copied drawings at, say, the Fog, which had a really nice setup for that. We copied Ang and Rubens and Raphael, and I don't know who all was there. And we also copied, I should speak for myself, because Gammell had us all doing slightly different things based on what he perceived to be our, what was called for us at the time. And and then we would, at some point or another, copy pictures in museums. And that usually was, as many times as I did that before I'd studied for a while, I found that to be something I was so unskilled with that it was way over my head. Even the guys like, Sargent and Degas you see doing that are usually doing that as just showing a few preliminary markings. There are a couple copies that are more elaborate than that by both those guys. I should say, at least I know for sure Degas. But, and so those things are all done, and my students have done those as well. But so if you put it down in a run, you'd say, well, I basically set you up to do casts, and when you've got, and it's that cast drawing thing is primarily to name the elements of the visual, the components of the visual world. And so you do that, and I say that it's what it is. I say it's a naming process, but we do it. We set up the cast so that the outline is the dominant effect. So the work is being done as you were by an academic painter. We're working from the outline, and you learn about the line of shadow, what middle tones are, what the atmosphere is in the shadows, and all this sort of stuff. And you're putting it into practice. At the same time, you're being corrected in your shape making and all those sorts of things. How we're different from other studios that way is that we don't do site size. We don't pre-measure at all, except with our eyes. So we put down phenomena, and we observe its relationship. Initially, we observe relationships between things. We put down shapes in relation to each other, and we adjust them in relation to each other. And that process is the one that eventually I say to students, this is what drawing looks like, a Boston School way of thinking. And you can see that in drawings for the Blue Cup, or certain of the portraits by Benson. Some of the stuff by Tarbell. You can see that the approach to drawing is not a clean, crispy cutout outline and then noodling between those lines, not even a little. And it's not and it's also not a top to bottom, window shaded approach. We don't paint that way. That is old school, classic sort of academic stuff. People do a really fine, typically a very fine outline, and then just literally travel down to the bottom, at least with some serious amount of detail, and then maybe do that again. Our approach is different, but but yeah, so basically, what I have is a picture making studio where the center of your activity for several years is the still life, where you really learn to make pictures. We have classes on composition. We seriously discuss composition. I suggest we discuss it in ways that you've never seen anywhere else, which I mean to, by the way, also get online at some point. I think I'm going long on this, but I'm not sure. I'm wandering a bit too, so I'm not sure if I'm answering all your questions. But from the cast, if you did it in a systematic way, you'd say we teach cast drawing and encourage people to do memory drawing, and while they're doing that, they begin to set up a still life early. I try to get in my studio people working on a still life almost as early as they start drawing, because the necessities of paint, if you've done all this cast work from outlines, you'll get to a year later, and I used to find students just totally balked at the idea of painting in visual order. So I get the painting stuff, the color discussion going really early with students. And then, but it's a still life process. And then as people are moving along, I move them into portrait drawing and painting, as well as figure drawing, where in all those other ways you learn to draw better and better. So my program is the least expensive out there. It's way under. It's not a $10,000 number like you hear so often now. I made a point, coming from a very impoverished background, shall we say. I don't think impoverished is quite the right word, but it was a lower middle class background. I couldn't have afforded to be in my studio even, and I've tried to do everything. I couldn't afford to be in anybody else's studio around. I've tried to do everything to make my studio available to non-rich kids, and so if you fit that, if you're a person who really loves color, the light of the Boston School, and the concepts related to Impressionism that are bigger than just Monet and blotches, that's the Boston School of thinking. I really would love to have more conversation with you, and we can have that privately if I haven't been clear enough about what we do. I am now, as I said at the very beginning of this thing, trying to get to the point where I see that the big problem for students is to get transitioned into a world of where they can make a living at painting. And what happened to me, and providentially, was that somebody came up to me and said, I was teaching an evening class, and they came up to me and said, look, I want you to teach me what Gammell taught you right from the beginning, the right way, because nobody would do it. None of the Gammell students around me were up to it, or they were doing other things. And that was my opportunity. And I said, well, you've got 3 or 4 people in a good working space. And it was very much like the French model that way. And I will do just that for you. And so that became my transition, a little bit of a bridge. And I found myself just really loving teaching. And then the next thing I found out was that I really grew by teaching. I really became, the need to verbalize, the need to be living what you're saying, do what you tell students to do. These things are so good that I now would recommend anybody. And I've tried to set up now so that my students can have that transition time, and I can help them try to create the next ateliers. But this is all in the works, you know what I mean? And I would really like to be able to help that next generation jump to the next place, even while they may want to develop further with me, and if we can figure out how to do that. I mean, a lot of people can come to me and they can study for a few years, but they run out of dollars. And to me, that's one of the greater disappointments, to get people to a certain point. And then it's going to be an enormously longer process for you to sort out the rest of it than it would be if you could at least be in the vicinity and have more conversations and that sort of thing. So there's the model, my inadequate wandering version of it. And I'd love to talk to you in person, anybody who's interested. Subscribe, comment, send questions, share. I'm very pleased to be doing this. I hope it's of some benefit to each of you. Thank you very much. See you next time.